when we're ready. And Seth, will you be taking questions?
Yeah, I'm going to just a 15-minute presentation and then a 10-minute Q&A
Cool.
afterwards. Would you like me to do that?
Sure.
Check 1, 2.
Did that remind me to do it.
Do you want me to just leave this? Just tap it once.
Okay.
It's on right now. It's green. You'll just tap it. That's live. Exactly. Tap it, and now we're live. So it's green. Just press it once. You don't need to hold it or anything. Just press it. It'll turn green. And after you do your intro,
that's it, you know. So now on, you're eating no spinach, you know, this. So every time I see her, I'm like, Diane, you still got food on that spatial image? She's like, oh yeah. It's wonderful. So cool you guys can do that together. Well, I hear 60, 70, 45. So.
We're gonna need maybe like 2 or 3 minutes. Is that cool? Awesome. Our camera control is it's being its old self.
Yeah, just let, this is the one, what's your name again, dear? What's your name again? Kathy's gonna introduce me.
Yep.
Sean's saying that you
Maybe like, yeah, maybe 2 or 3 minutes. Awesome. Awesome. Thanks, guys.
The microphone here, didn't he?
Are you ready?
I am if he is. I don't
Oh,
know if he
let's
is.
wait for it. It's on mute right now, but if you press the bottom of it, it'll be ready to go. You want to wait for Sean to say that he's ready, maybe? Want to make sure Sean's ready to go? He'll probably come back and let us know when he's ready. This is such a nice city hall you have here.
This is town hall, and
Yeah.
we used to meet up at the fire station because they have a really nice, brand new fire station that they did. But then town hall decided they wanted to record all of our programs, so they moved us
Great.
down here so they could do that.
Yeah, look at this. There's really cool cameras and stuff.
Yeah,
That's lovely.
felt well.
And then you broadcast presentations on the community TV.
Yeah,
Oh, very cool.
on the local TV.
Love it.
Yeah. This was especially good during COVID.
All right, Sean says we're good to go. Oh, yeah.
Good evening. Is it on?
Oh, you got to tap the bottom there. Let me see here. Testing, testing. All right. I think it's on. Yeah, there you go.
Okay, if you can't hear, I'm delighted everybody tonight to the Historical Society program. We have a wonderful speaker tonight. His name is Sean Goldstein.
Seth.
I'm sorry,
Seth Goldstein.
Seth Gold.
Yeah. It's close, very close.
I've had a busy day. I'm not even sure who I am, let alone who he is. So, he's affiliated with the Atlantic Black Box Project, which is a nonprofit that examines Maine and New England's marginalized history. He's a maritime historian. He's a member of the South Portland Historical Society, and he teaches history at the Maine College of Art and Design. He's a museum director for the Cushing's Point Museum, and his work sheds light on lesser-known aspects of Maine's history and contributes to a more comprehensive understanding of the region's past. And tonight he's going to talk to us all about Pirates of New England, and I'm sure that's an interest to all of us. So please welcome Seth Goldstein.
Awesome. Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. I'll just tell you a little bit more about myself, and thank you for that introduction, Kathy. Can you press the button again? Yeah, wonderful. So as Kathy said, I'm a maritime historian. I am the director of development for the South Portland Historical Society, which basically means I raise our money. So in essence, I raise the money to pay myself is a big part of what I do. And then I direct our Cushing's Point Museum, which if you ever find yourself in South Portland at Buglight Park, which is a lovely park overlooking Casco Bay with a great view of the Portland skyline, we have our museum right there, and we have great exhibits, including a permanent exhibit on the Liberty shipyards, which was a big part of South Portland's history. We built 276 cargo vessels there during World War II. 30,000 people worked 24 hours a day, including 3,700 women who were, we affectionately call them Wendy the Welders, the cousin to Rosie the Riveter, who worked at the shipyard in a variety of capacities, but certainly as welders. And we have some great photographs of these women wearing welding gear. And also, a variety of other really nifty exhibits. So come check us out in South Portland. I'm a maritime historian, and so the way I became a maritime historian is my dad was a high school librarian where I grew up on Cape Cod, and my dad would bring home books for me about local Cape Cod shipwrecks when I was like very young, like 6, 7 years old. And the joke here is I must have been a weird kid because I was fascinated at a young age by some of these shipwrecks and some of the horrible things that would happen. And I still remember one today that I read about when I was a kid. Growing up on Cape Cod's known as the graveyard of the Atlantic because shipping going from New York to Boston would have to sail around Cape Cod before the Cape Cod Canal was built, and that was built in the 1930s during the Depression. But before that, if a storm came up and there was a historic sailing vessel sailing up the backside of Cape Cod, all the captains could really do is throw out the anchors and pray, and very often those prayers were not enough. In fact, we'll talk about a big shipwreck in just a little bit. And so they would wind up on what we would call the backside of Cape Cod, washed up on the beach there. And so I still remember this one wreck. It was a boat carrying a cargo of jute, fiber that they would have used for making cloth historically. And it was during the winter, so the boat washed up on the backside of the Cape, so the sailors climbed up into the rigging of this old sailing vessel. Well, that's where they were found in the morning, entombed in ice, frozen to death, still clinging to the rigging. And I thought that was fascinating, right? So that's why I must have been a weird kid. The other thing that inspired me to become a maritime historian was in 1984, a gentleman by the name of Barry Clifford discovered the wreck of the pirate ship Witta off of Cape Cod. And I'll share some information about the Witta with you in just a little bit. But this was the first ever authenticated pirate ship wreck ever discovered, and happened during my childhood as I was growing up on Cape Cod. They had pulled up 400,000 artifacts from this one shipwreck, the Witta. And like I said, I'll share more about the Witta with you in just a little bit. But it's the first ever authenticated pirate shipwreck ever discovered. So I got my undergraduate degree in history from the University of Santa Cruz in California, where our mascot is the banana slug, which, as you can imagine, strikes fear into the heart of all of our athletic opponents. And then I got my master's degree from Northeastern University. I have a degree in global historical theory. which didn't serve me very well for many years, but now I've been able to make a career out of it. So the types of topics that I study, I did my master's thesis on New England whaling, which I thought was very interesting. I had these New England whalers sailing all around the world. Obviously shipwrecks, the Life-Saving Service, which was the predecessor of the Coast Guard, global piracy, and in fact I taught a course at the Maine College of Art and Design on global piracy to the young people there. And unsurprising to probably anybody in the room, 20-year-old art school students think pirates are really cool. And so the class was very well received by the art school students who weren't there to learn history. They wanted to do their ceramics or their painting. So I tried to make it interesting for them, and I taught them history through piracy. So that's me, and that's kind of my interest and what I'm about. And so tonight I'm very happy to share with you a topic that I've been studying for as long as I can remember, piracy, and specifically pirates in New England. And very interestingly, I think a lot of us have a lot of misconceptions about piracy. What we know about pirates, a lot of it is not historical fact. A lot of it we get through popular culture. So Treasure Island, for example, nobody ever walked the plank, right? That's something that came along in novels and movies in the 1800s and 1900s. And so, a lot of times we think of pirates, we think of what? We think of Pirates of the Caribbean, right? We think of sparkling blue waters and parrots and palm trees and Pieces of Eight. And there were Pieces of Eight, but there were pirates right here in New England, and they were very active here in New England as they were in other parts of the world. So you can break what's known as the golden age of piracy into 3 phases. And so the golden age of piracy is really just a brief period. It's a century. And then you have initially the buccaneers, and this is the period 1650 to 1680. This is very interesting. They get their name from the French word boucan, which was a type of grill that they would use to smoke meat, and then they would sell it to passing ships. This was taking place on the island of Hispaniola. And so you had mainly French guys, and they're hunting feral cows, and they're grilling them on green wood, smoking them on these boucans. Check this out. This is where you get the term barbecue from, right? It's from the boucan. And so they were known as buccaneers. This was a method of food preservation that they learned from the indigenous Americans in the Caribbean. So they saw the indigenous Americans preserving meat this way, and they did the same thing, preserving meat over these green wood boucans and then selling it to passing ships. Captain Morgan, perhaps the most famous of this particular group of pirates, they are primarily the buccaneers, English and French, and they attack mainly the shipping of Spain. Your next phase of piracy moves into the Indian Ocean in the 1690s, where the pirates have a major base on the island of Madagascar. It's, of course, off the east coast of Africa. William Kidd is probably the best well-known example of this group of pirates. And then finally, this is the period of piracy that we're all most familiar with. And you can see what a brief amount of time it is. It's just a decade, from 716 to 1726. This is the golden age of the golden age of piracy, if you will. Most famous members were Edward Teach, a.k.a. Blackbeard. But most of the pirates that we're familiar with, Stede Bonnet, Calico Jack Rackham, the famous women pirates, Mary Read and Anne Bonny, Ben Hornigold, are all from this period, this last little gasp of piracy from 1716 to 1726. So pirate crews formed in one of 2 ways: mutiny aboard a merchant vessel, or the splitting of existing pirate crews due to too many members on board a given ship, or perhaps there would be a disagreement. And in fact, this is what happened. Ben Hornigold was a gentleman, English, and he had with him, Blackbeard was one of the pirates who sailed underneath him, and Calico Jack Rackham. A lot of these guys go on to become captains in their own right. And Ben Hornigold wouldn't attack British shipping because he was British, and the other pirates were like, Ben Hornigold, that's crazy, we're pirates, we don't care. And they would attack anybody, and so the crew split, some of them going with Ben Hornigold, others going off on their own, including Black Sam Bellamy, who we'll talk about in just a little bit, very important pirate to New England history. So they would split sometimes and form two crews, and there's actually a kind of genealogy of pirates where you can see where this guy served under this guy, became a captain, and then there was somebody served under him and became a captain. Most of these famous pirates that we're aware of in popular culture were related to each other in this way. So they all would get together and they would draft what was known as the ship's articles. And these were the rules that they would all live under. So they would all agree to these articles and they would put their mark on the articles. Many of them could not write, so they couldn't sign their names, but they would put their mark. Sometimes that was just an X, agreeing to these rules that they would live by. And then next they would elect their leaders. And the leaders, basically the captain and the quartermaster, were elected, and they served at the will of the crew and could be taken out of their office at any time, right? So isn't that kind of, democratic of them, right? So it's the early democratic principles that the pirates are engaging here, well before a lot of people are talking about democratic principles. So they would elect their captain, and the captain only had power when they were chasing or fighting or being chased. Other than that, he was just a regular crewman. He didn't get any special food or beverage. He didn't get a special cabin. He didn't have any special treatment. He was treated as just a regular crewman. And if people didn't like the way that he was captaining, he would be voted out, and they would elect a new captain. The crew's articles also would stipulate how long they would stay together. Very often they would stay together for a certain amount of time until they had stolen a certain amount of money. So, we're not going to break up the band until everybody has, 50 pounds of gold, something like that. Shares of a prize to be divided. Now, the share system, some of you may be aware of, is an ancient system of compensating sailors in which each sailor receives a certain amount of profit from a given voyage. They would do this in fishing vessels here in Maine. So the fishermen would go out and then they would get a certain amount of the catch. It's an incentive to have them work hard. It's known as the share system. And they're still practicing the share system. For example, if any of you have ever watched Deadliest Catch about crab fishing in Alaska, they're still employing a share system in the Alaskan crab fishery. So everybody gets a certain percentage, a share. Most of the crew would receive one share, with the captain receiving a little bit more than that. Sometimes the captain would receive not much more, maybe a share and a half, at the most double what the average average pirate was making. The quartermaster usually a share and a quarter to a share and a half, and then people who had special skills like carpenters would receive an extra half share as well. They had a form of early social security. Injured pirates would be taken care of. So the articles would stipulate, for example, that you would get a certain amount of pieces of 8 if you lost your right arm. Right arm was worth slightly more than your left arm. So say, 700 pieces of 8 for the right arm, but only 600 pieces of 8 for your left arm. Now, I'm not sure if this was dependent on if you were right or left-handed, but same thing for your leg. You would get slightly more for your right leg than your left leg, which is interesting. Some pirates did not allow gambling or drinking on board in an effort to curb fighting. Although I would say percentage-wise, 85% of them did allow drinking, smoking. There was no fighting allowed on board. And usually the rule was if you wanted to gamble and smoke tobacco, you had to do so on deck after a certain time because they didn't want people blowing up the ship. And so if they're below decks and they're smoking and there's gunpowder, things could go kablooey. And so in an effort to curb that, gambling, fraternizing, drinking, smoking, only allowed on deck after lights out. conflict between two individuals to be settled on shore with pistols and swords. So usually how this would work was, if you had a conflict with somebody, they would land, you would go, they would each get one shot at each other. Now, because at that time, guns only had one shot, right, and had to be reloaded after that. You get one shot, and then if nobody was hit by a ball, they would resort to swords. And it was just until an individual was injured. They didn't fight to the death. But all quarrels were settled on land by pistol and sword. And then finally, all major decisions made by a vote of the whole crew. Hey, where should we go look for booty? Do you guys want to go to Madagascar? Should we go to the Caribbean? How are you going to go mess with the fishermen up in Newfoundland? And then they would all vote, and that's how they would make their decisions. Once again, very democratic early on. So I find this very interesting. In the early colonial period, Wabanaki freedom fighters here in Maine were labeled as pirates. And so I have a quote here. This is from an article that was published in Sea History magazine in 2022. And so I quote, a term of convenience, the word piracy was already loaded with economic and political implications from beyond the New England coast. Notoriously and overwhelmingly influencing trade and travel, pirates dominated the period between 1650 and 1750, now referred to, as you all know, the Golden Age of piracy. The geographic and cultural shifts of this term into Anglo-Wabanaki context coincide with the broader British effort to delegitimize indigenous resistance to colonial expansion. And so let me just unpack that a little bit. So you had Wabanaki sailors, and some of you may know the Wabanaki have always been very proficient at sailing. They just had ocean-going canoes before the Europeans arrived. You had different waves of indigenous Americans who would come. Some of them would go out into the deep seas and would hunt for swordfish. Some of them would even harpoon whales. So very proficient in boating and sailing. When the Europeans, the English, arrive here in Maine, the Wabanaki quickly learned how to operate their European vessels. These were mainly shallops at this time, so small, one-masted vessels, and the Wabanaki would purchase them from Europeans, or they would steal them from Europeans or take them in battle, and they would learn how to sail them just as good, if not better, than the English, and they would use them against the English. And so there were instances where the English would get beat by these Wabanaki, and the Wabanaki are using the English's technology against them. Hence the name of the article, They Sail Incomparably Well. And so the English use this term pirate to delegitimize the Wabanaki's resistance. And so the Wabanaki, from their perspective, they're freedom fighters. They're fighting to maintain their land and their freedom here in what would become the state of Maine. And so what the English was doing, they would call them pirates. And what's suggested there is that once the Wabanaki would defeat them, using their own boats against them, they would say, oh, well, the only reason they did it was because they were pirates, which in some way suggests that the Wabanaki were doing something underhanded. The only reason they could defeat the English was because they were pirates and they were doing something sneaky or underhanded or some sort of tactic that wasn't up to snuff. And you see this, when I taught my pirate class with my students at the Maine College of Art and Design, you see this throughout history over and over again. People in positions of power would use this term pirate to delegitimize other individuals. Very often had an economic aspect to it. So here I have, once again, a quote from that article, They Sail Incomparably Well. It was originally published in the Journal of American History, Volume 101. And I'll quote again, after Indians seized a large schooner with 2 swivel guns from the Isle of Shoals during Doomer's War in the 1720s, a modest sloop and shallop crewed by Maine and Ipswich men were commissioned to sail in pursuit. Not long after the departure, the dejected crews returned with their rigging much damaged by the swivel guns and were able to, quote, give no other account of the enemy then they had gone into Penobscot. So this is an example where the Wabanaki used the English technology against them and defeated them. Further, stunned residents of York, Maine witnessed a sloop and a ketch chase down and capture the crew of a local fishing captain after the natives fired a great gun at him. During King William's War in 1692, remarking also, quote, they sail incomparably well. So these guys, they were defeated by the Wabanaki, and so all they could say once they got back to town after their defeat was, these Wabanaki sail incomparably well, just as well as anybody, if not better. And so you can see in the image here, this is a Mi'kmaq petroglyph, and you can see this is indigenous people sailing a European vessel, and down here from the Abbey Museum, a canoe made out of birch bark. Dixie Bull is recognized as the first pirate here in Maine. And what a cool name, too, right? Dixie Bull. Dixie Bull arrives in Maine in the 1630s, and he conducts a brisk trade for beaver pelts with the Wabanaki. This is what's going on early in the colonial period. In addition to fishing, at the time, there is a craze in Paris for beaver fur hats. And so a lot of people, European people, are here trading trade goods for these beaver pelts, and that's exactly what Mr. Bull is doing. And so he's attacked in 1632, once again, very early in the colonial period, right, 1632, just a few years after the Pilgrims arrived. He's attacked by a group of French privateers. According to the book Pirates of New England Coast, 1630 to 1670, the French took Bull's shallop and his trade goods, which consisted of, quote, coats, rugs, blankets, biscuits, etc. And so what happens is, you know, the Bull has all his trade goods stolen by these French privateers, and he's got nothing now, right? And so he's furious, and he goes out in pursuit of the French with a small force, but he can't find the French. And so wanting to replace his lost trade goods, he resorts to capturing 2 English vessels. Well, this makes Mr. Bull a pirate now. He's attacking vessels of his own country. He then sets his sights on the fort at Pemaquid, at the mouth of the Pemaquid River, northeast of modern Booth Bay Harbor. The fort at that time was a robust trade center and home to roughly 500 English traders and fishermen. Bull and his men managed to steal food and goods to the value of 500 British pounds, which in terms of today's money, between $70,000 to $150,000 that he's able to steal from the fort at Pemaquid. However, on their way out of the harbor, a well-placed shot from the fort kills one of his men. And this seems to have really scared Dixie Bull and his men, because following that, they kind of repent. They send out 4 armed vessels from Piscataqua after him, which is modern-day Portsmouth, for those of you who don't know. But they can't find him. But this expedition to track down Dixie Bull is considered to be the first naval expedition in New England history. This is once again in the 1630s. Occasional sightings and encounters over the next few months, but it seems that Bull and his men are very fearful after the loss of their compatriot. They pay for goods at English plantations following this. They give up excessive drinking. Oh, perish the thought. And they send letters to all the governors of the English colonies asserting their desire to no longer attack British shipping. And then he's never captured. He's one of these individuals who just disappears from history. We don't know what happened to Dixie Bull. There's some theories that he escaped to a French settlement. He returned to England. Some say that he was killed by indigenous Americans, but we don't know. He just disappears from history sometime in the 1630s. But as I said, Dixie Bull, considered the first pirate here in New England. So if you take a look at this map up here, what you'll see is this is kind of what the pirates called the pirate round. And so they would do this seasonal circuit around the Atlantic. And so they would be here in the West Indies during the winter. But during the summer, to avoid hurricanes, they would sail up to the Canadian Maritimes, where there were large fleets of European fishermen. And so they would go and they would mess with the fishermen. Wasn't particularly profitable, but sometimes they would capture a boat that had a large quantity of liquor on board or various goods. It's not the gold of the Spanish Main, but it was worth their time, and they avoided hurricanes, and they sometimes would be able to pick up more men for their crews. And that's exactly what happened in this instance. Now, this guy, Edward Lowe, he's not a nice guy. He's known as one of the more sadistic pirates in world history. I think in today's terminology, we would call him a sociopath. Some of these pirates were, and some of them, seemed like they were nice fellows. Edward Lowe was not. And so Philip Ashton is a fisherman from Marblehead, Massachusetts. He's captured by Edward Lowe, once again off the Canadian Maritime, so he's up there fishing. And at this time, there's, in the summer, there might be hundreds of fishing vessels in the Canadian Maritimes. Some of them from New England, many of them from England, France, Spain, the Basque countries, Portugal, etc. And so Edward Lowe goes up there, and once again, he's known for his extreme cruelty. So this guy, Philip Ashton, he's a fisherman. He becomes what's known as a forced man. So he doesn't sign the articles. He's forced to join the crew. And this is a very important distinction, right? If you were a forced man and your boat was captured, your pirate boat, and you could prove that you were a forced man and that you hadn't engaged in any attacks, you would be freed. If you had signed the ship's articles or had engaged in an attack, you would be hung, right? So this distinction between being a forced man and somebody who freely signs the articles is a very important distinction, particularly if you're captured. And so he was a sailor. They needed sailors, and they tried many, many times to force Philip Ashton to sign the ship's articles. Sometimes they would torture him to do so, and he never did. He never signed the ship's articles. Sailors with particular skills, the cook, the carpenter, doctors in particular, were very much desired by the pirate crews, and so they were commonly forced onto pirate boats to become part of the crew. So they would need carpenters, they would need doctors, they would need cooks, and so if they captured a boat that had one of these individuals, they would very often be forced to join the pirate crew. Pardon me. I set my alarm for 7 a.m., but 7 p.m. I have to get up early. These common sailors would also be forced just for their manual labor, in addition to the cooks and the carpenters and the doctors. So pirates during the age of piracy would employ torture to force captives to reveal any hidden loot that they might have hidden on their person or in the captured vessel. Merchant captains would also be tortured, sometimes even killed if their crews reported to the pirates that they had been severe to their sailors. So they would capture a boat, and they would go up to the sailors, and they'd be like, hey, how's the captain on this boat? Is he nice to you guys? Is he not nice? And if they found out, if the sailors were like, yeah, he's kind of mean to us, then they would sometimes torture these captains, sometimes kill them. But there were also instances where if the crew was like, no, he's a good captain, he's nice, he gives us enough to eat, and we're never whipped, sometimes they would be given their boats back. And so this happened as well. But once again, getting back to Edward Lowe, who, as I said, in today's terminology would probably be known as a sociopath, it was his habit to slice off a part of the captive's body, lips, nose, or ears, and then he would roast them and then force the individual to eat their own roasted body part. So you can imagine, my kids hear a lot of this kind of stuff, right? And what you see here is a picture of what was known as the sweat. And this was just like a kind of a form of entertainment for the pirates. They would force an individual to run around the mast below decks while stabbing them with knives and such as a fiddle played. And as I said, this was a form of torture and entertainment that the pirates employed known as the sweat. This is Fort Loyal in Portland. In August 1689, a gentleman by the name of Thomas Pound departs Boston Harbor with a small crew of 12 individuals. He intends to sail to the Caribbean to prey on French shipping in the West Indies. But first, he decides he needs a bigger boat. We're going to need a bigger boat, like that famous line from Jaws. And so he also needs more food, maybe some more men, arms, ammunition. So he takes a fishing vessel and sails to Casco Bay here in Maine, where they steal a calf and 3 sheep from one of the islands in the harbor. Interesting story there. You know, it was a lot cheaper to put livestock on islands than it was to build fences. And that's why you'll see islands off the coast of Maine that are Hog Island, Ram Island, Calf Island. In fact, one of the islands in Casco Bay, which is today Diamond Island, there's Great Diamond Island, used to be known as Hog Island. And then a bunch of rich tourists bought land there, and they didn't want to summer on Hog Island, so they changed the name to Diamond Island. But anyways, they get some livestock, and then they sail into Portland Harbor, and they go to Fort Loyal. This would be in the 1689, so late in the 1600s. They sail into the harbor. They sail right up to Fort Loyal, which is at the foot, for those of you who know, Portland, of modern-day India Street. Now, the Portland waterfront has all been filled in the 1850s, so this would have been the corner of 4 and India Street, because Commercial Street, which is right along the water in Portland, sits on fill. It was filled in the 1850s. So there's this very famous fort there during the colonial period. Pound, he meets with the fort captain, this guy Sylvanus Davis, who was a pretty famous guy in Maine history. He was known as an Indian fighter, fought the Wabanaki. He requests from Davis food, water, and the use of the fort's surgeon to attend to an injured crew member. Now, the captain of the fort, Davis, becomes suspicious when he hears that the vessel has an unusually large crew for a fishing vessel. And then his suspicions are only heightened when the doctor comes back and seems kind of nervous and a little fussy. So what had happened, in fact, was Pound had attempted to persuade the doctor to join him on this piratical trip to the West Indies. And the doctor had declined, but came back very nervous. But unknown to Davis, the captain of the fort, 2 of the fort's soldiers had agreed to join the pirate crew. So there's a quote from a book called Black Flags, Blue Water, The Epic History of America's Most Notorious Pirates by Eric J. Dolan, who's a well-known maritime historian. And he says, that evening Davis, once again Davis is the captain of the fort, set armed guards around the fort and told them to keep a good watch on the water side. And then at midnight, 7 soldiers who had decided to cast their lot with Pound, the guy who wanted to become a pirate, rose up and trained their guns on their fellows. Gathering all the arms and ammunition and clothing they could carry, the traders took the fort's boat out to the Mary, which was the name of the ketch, and soon thereafter set a course for Cape Cod. So 7 soldiers abscond from this fort that night. Pound and his crew capture several vessels off of Cape Cod over the next few weeks, and the governor of Massachusetts, Simon Bradstreet, sends out a boat with 20 soldiers under the command of Captain Samuel Pease to capture the pirates. The soldiers catch up to Pound off the coast of Martha's Vineyard, and a battle ensues. In response to Pease's demand that Pound strike his flag, Pound says, "Come aboard, ye dogs, and I will strike you presently." After an hour of fighting, the soldiers board the pirate vessel, and after firing a volley from their muskets, beat the pirates into submission with the butts of their guns. 4 pirates are killed, and the rest taken back to Boston for trial. Pound is sent to England, where, for unknown reasons, these charges are dismissed against him. And then he kind of disappears from history, another one of these individuals. But it's notable, so in 1690, Fort Loyal is attacked by a large contingent of French and Wabanakis. And so the loss of these 7 individuals certainly does not help the situation. And so what you have is all of the citizens from what would later become Portland have retired to the fort for safety, and the soldiers, and they're besieged for a couple of 3 days by the French and the Wabanaki, and the English are running out of ammunition, and the French and Wabanaki have dug trenches up to the fort palisades, and they're throwing primitive grenades over the fort walls, And so the English say, hey, can we have terms? We'll surrender if you'll let us, head out to the closest English settlement. And the French say, sure, come on out. But what happens is when the English surrender, they're massacred by the French Wabanaki allies. And, this sounds like kind of a horrible thing, but I think we have to remember the context. These Wabanaki have been suffering what we would today term genocidal treatment at the hands of the English, who were stealing their land, trying to force religion on them, trying to take their culture from them, who had issued a bounty on their scalps. And so really, these Wabanaki, they see themselves as freedom fighters. They massacre these English colonists, and they're able to reassert their claim to the land that would later be known as Portland for 15 years. For 15 years, no English colonists return to what is known as Portland. So historians hypothesize, this loss of 7 individuals from the piratical incursion in Portland, was that a factor that led to Fort Loyal being captured the next year? This is the Witta Galley. The Witta was that pirate wreck that I told you about that was discovered in 1984 off the coast of Cape Cod. And she sinks in this a horrific gale in 1717. It's one of those storms, they would call it a perfect storm today, right? When you have 2 weather systems that join together, kind of magnify, intensify. So the Witta Galley is named the Witta Galley because she was a slaving vessel. And she's named after the port of Ouidah on the west coast of Africa, which is today in modern-day Benin. And so she was built expressly for the slave trade by the English. And she's a galley, which means she could be rowed as well as sailed. So she had ports that they would open up, and they would have these big, long oars, and they could row the Witta Galley. Let's see, built in London in 1715 as a slave ship. She left on her maiden voyage in early 1716, 300-ton galley, as I said, could be rowed or sail. She represented the height of nautical technology for her day. She was shallow drafted with a low silhouette. Shallow draft means she didn't take too much water. She could sit in very shallow water. That's what a draft is, right? Deep draft means you need more water. That means you need a deeper harbor. This was a shallow draft. She could come into bays that weren't that deep, maybe sail up rivers, things like that. She had a low silhouette, which was important. If you were a slaving vessel and somebody was trying to interdict the slaving vessels, which would happen later in history, anti-slavery patrols. She was incredibly fast, capable of speeds of up to 13 knots, which is pretty fast for that day. Like all slave ships, the Witta carried an arsenal of weaponry, including 18 mounted cannons for defense against attack by African and European warships or pirates. On her maiden voyage, the Witta set sail from London and into the Atlantic, turned south toward the African coast. Slave ships like the Witta would work their way south and east around West Africa from modern-day Gambia and Senegal to Nigeria and Gabon, filling their holds with slaves until they had a full load of, quote, human cargo. Captives might be on board for months, waiting for the ship to fill before they set sail across the Atlantic, Caribbean bound. And this is what was known as, some of you I'm sure have heard of it before, the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage was this horrible voyage that the enslaved Africans were forced to endure after they had been kidnapped from their homeland, being brought to slavery in the West Indies, and some of them would be brought here to New England as well. So pirate crews were very ethnically diverse. In fact, Marcus Rediker, who wrote a great book about pirates, he's a well-known maritime historian, he has called pirates motley crews because of their ethnic diversity. So not motley crew like the 1980s hair band, right? But ethnically diverse. You can see here in this picture, the gentleman on the left, it was named Hendrik Quintar. He's African and Dutch descent, so probably somebody who had never been enslaved, maybe somebody of African heritage who was free. On the far right, you see John Julian, who was Mosquito Native American from southern Central America. I think that would be the coast of modern-day Belize. And as I said, they were known as motley crews. So you can see people of African descent. Sometimes you would have self-emancipating enslaved Africans, people who had been enslaved and who had run away would join pirate crews. Sometimes free Africans and native indigenous people from all over the Americas, South America, Central America, Mexico, and North America as well. And then a variety of European nationalities in addition to that. So ethnically diverse. And so this is from Marcus Rediker's book. You can see a picture over here of what was known as a maroon. These were people who were enslaved Africans who escaped into the jungles of places like Jamaica or Suriname, which is a Dutch colony in South America, Hispaniola, which would later become Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And so they would escape into the jungle, and they would form villages that were very similar to the villages they had lived in West Africa. Sometimes these Maroons would join indigenous Americans and live with them side by side in indigenous villages. So as I had said, a lot of these self-emancipating enslaved Africans would join pirate crews. And you can see from the table here from Marcus Rediker's book just how diverse some of these crews were. So for example, Black Sam Bellamy, who was the captain of the Witta, a little less than 15% of his crew was African heritage. But you can see here Thatch. That's Blackbeard, by the way, his real name Edward Thatch, but went by Blackbeard. It's more colorful of a name, right? 60% black by one estimate, 36% African heritage by another estimate. This guy Labouche, who was also known as the Buzzard, was a French pirate, also one of those guys who we would today qualify as a sociopath, really like to torture people. 50% of his crew, African heritage. So it gives you a sense for how diverse these crews were at a time where there wasn't a lot of diversity in many parts of the world. About a quarter of the pirates were broadly American, associated with the West Indies or North America. A huge majority of the West Indians were linked to the two historic strongholds of piracy, the Bahamas and Jamaica. And a few were connected to smaller islands such as Barbados, Martinique, and Antigua. The North Americans were more widely dispersed, the greatest number coming from Massachusetts, indigenous Americans mostly from the Boston area, and a smattering from almost everywhere else, Rhode Island, New York, South Carolina. And so Black Sam Bellamy, he's known as the Prince Pirate because he was really pretty forgiving to the people he captured. And so sometimes he would give merchants back their boats. He'd take all the goods off the boats, but he'd be like, hey, why don't you keep your boat? But this one captain that he captured was giving him a hard time, and he said, Bellamy wanted to give him his boat back, but the crew said no. And you'll remember, the captain didn't have any power. The crew voted no, and so this merchant captain didn't get his boat back. So he's mad at Bellamy, and he tells to Bellamy, you're not really a captain, right? You don't have any power over your crew. And so Bellamy says, damn ye, ye are a sneaking puppy, and so are all those who will submit to be governed by the laws which rich men have made for their own security. For the cowardly whelps have not the courage otherwise to defend what they get by their knavery. But damn ye altogether, damn them for a pack of crafty rascals, and you who serve them for a parcel of hen-hearted numbskulls. They vilify, the scoundrels do, when there is only the difference, they rob the poor under the cover of the law, forsooth, and we plunder the rich under the protection of our courage, right? Is what Black Sam Bellamy said. So pretty cool little speech there. But this reminds me that once again, we have this kind of stereotypical view of pirates. They're from the Caribbean. They walked the plank. They had parrots on their shoulders, and we think of them as a lot of them as being loners, out on their own, and just in it to drink a lot of rum and do some wenching and to make some gold. But the fact of the matter is that many of these individuals had families. They were sailors in the Navy, and in between wars, they would be out of work and with no way to feed their families. And so they would resort to piracy because it was all they knew. was how to be a sailor. And they were out of work, and there wasn't enough jobs on the merchant vessels. And so, once again, a lot of these individuals who turned pirates were family men just looking to provide for their children and their wives. And there's a couple of great books on that topic. But, here Bellamy is saying, like, we're robbing under the strength of our own courage. All of you rich merchants and the people who own you are robbing because you've got the law to back you up, and you're robbing from poor people, taking their taxes, charging them, high rates for goods and things like that. And we just rob under our own courage. Now, this is interesting. So, Black Sam Bellamy, he's in the Caribbean, and he's one of the most prolific pirates of all time. And in a year, he captures about 40 vessels. And one of them is the Witta. The Witta had delivered her cargo of enslaved Africans to Cuba, and then she was sailing with all of the trade goods back to England, going between Florida and Cuba. And Black Sam Bellamy and his crew see her, and he says, "Whew, that's a nice-looking boat, right? I bet that would make a nice flagship for my flotilla." And so he chases her for about a day, and eventually he captures her, and he makes her the flagship of this flotilla. So he moves all of these cannons on board, all of his booty, gold dust and diamonds, and everything that they had captured, silks, over the previous year. And then he sails up here to New England with a couple other smaller vessels. And they're headed to Richmond Island off the coast of Cape Elizabeth to careen their boats. And this is what careening is all about. In warm tropical waters, you would get sea worms that would turn the hull of a pirate vessel to this Swiss cheese here. And also you would get marine growth growing on the bottom of your boat, which could slow your boat down a couple of knots. And if you're a pirate, slowing your boat down a couple of knots could be the difference between catching a boat and missing it, or the difference between escaping the Navy and being captured and hung, right? So they're headed up here to Richmond Island to careen their vessels. And this is what the careening would look like, right? They would use block and tackle, and they would pull the boats over on their sides after they had beached them, and they would fill in all those holes, and they would scrape the barnacles and the seaweed. Once again, this would give the boat an additional couple of knots. And so they're coming up here to Maine to careen their vessels. We think Richmond Island off the coast of Cape Elizabeth, close to where I live today. And then for some unknown reason, Black Sam Bellamy diverts to Cape Cod. And the legend is that he had met this young woman on Cape Cod. Her name was Goody Hallett. And the legend is that, her hair was, golden, her eyes were as blue as Gull Pond in Wellfleet, blah, blah, blah. But he couldn't marry her because her family was like, this guy doesn't have anything, we're not going to let you marry some, unemployed sailor. He's a schlem. And so he goes to the West Indies to make his fortune. Originally, he's going to salvage a boat. A Spanish ship had sunk during a hurricane. By the time he gets there, it's all been salvaged, and so he turns pirate, right? And then, after one of the most successful piratical cruises in world history, he returns to New England, and some say he diverted to Cape Cod to marry Goody Hallett, to find his wife, his bride. And so this horrific storm comes up, 1717. He's off of Cape Cod, and they get blown onto a sandbar. And basically, the Witta just collapses in on itself. There's so much weight. He has all these cannons and precious metals, and the pirates are just crushed underneath it. And in fact, only 4 or 5 make it to shore. The gentlemen who make it to shore are brought to Boston, where they're hung for piracy, except for John Julian, who is the indigenous American from Central America. He's enslaved because indigenous Americans were enslaved at that time. So he's enslaved, and then he disappears from history. But the rest of these guys, they all drown, or the handful of them that are taken to Boston and hung. And the legend has it that Goody Hallett was on the beach that night. And she could hear the screams of the pirates as they drowned and were washed up on the beach. And some say she still walks the beaches of Cape Cod today. There's a better story to tell around Halloween. So this is a map, and this was done by the Massachusetts government at the time it's a colony, right? They tasked this guy, Captain Cyprian Southhack, sent by the governor of Massachusetts, to recover what he can from the wreck of the Witta, but he can't recover anything. It's too rough. But you see on this map here, he has noted on his chart where that wreck was. And this is the chart that Barry Clifford uses in 1984 to recover the wreck of the Witta. He also says here, Southhack says that he buried the bodies of about 100 pirates on the beach, right? So he comes, he encounters all these bodies washed up, he buries them. But he can't get out to the wreck of the Witta. The water's too rough. So what happens is, in 1984, Barry Clifford, he's been looking for this wreck for a long time, and he uses the chart. They're getting this signal that there's a lot of metal, but they can't get at it. It's underneath like 20 feet of sand. And so what he does is he creates something that goes around the propeller of his boat, and it diverts the power from the propeller down. It's just basically like a tube that goes, like a right angle, and it blows the sand away. And he's able to get at these artifacts, which are like 15 or 20 feet buried underneath the sand. And so he starts pulling up artifacts, but he doesn't know it's the Witta until he finds this bell. And on the bell, it says Witta Galley, 1716. And so now he knows for sure, authenticated, he has discovered the wreck of the pirate ship Witta, the first ever pirate ship wreck ever discovered. And he dives on it every summer. He can't dive in the winter because the conditions are too rough. It's too silty, too much sand, water's too rough. But every summer, him and his team of expert divers dive, and as I said, 400,000 artifacts is what they pulled up from the ocean floor. And he has a museum now in Yarmouth, Massachusetts, close to where I grew up. And just a couple weeks ago during April break, I took my family to the Cape. We still have my childhood home. And I convinced them to come to the Witta Museum with me. Oh my God, they're like, oh, Dad, do we have to? I was like, no, we'll be quick. I swear, I won't spend a lot of time there. But I got to see some of these artifacts in person for the very first time just a couple weeks ago. And I've been lecturing on this topic for at least a decade now, and showing pictures and sharing them with my classes at the Maine College of Art and Design. So I saw the bell. I got to see the actual bell, right, with the Witta on it. And it was like, for me, I'm a super maritime history nerd. It was like, so it's a really, if you ever find yourself in Yarmouth, it's a great museum. Now, there were so many cannons on board. They were using the cannons as ballast in the bottom of the boat because they had so many of them because they were so useful. And so what they have are cannons of all different calibers: French cannons, Dutch cannons, English cannons, 9-pound, 11-pound, 14-pound, because they just took whatever they could. And they said, well, maybe we'll use them later, but for now we'll just use them as ballast. And so they were in the bottom of the vessel. Lots and lots of pirate treasure, like real pirate treasure, right? And so there's some cool stuff in this one picture. One neat thing, so this is like a piece of 8, like a real piece of 8. This is real pirate booty. And you see this heart-shaped one here? Because they were minting stuff by hand. There wasn't necessarily a coin press. A lot of this stuff was minted in Spanish colonies in South America and Mexico. And there was a big mint in Potosi, in modern-day Bolivia, where there was a mountain full of silver. In fact, they say that they could have built a bridge of silver from Bolivia to Spain. There was so much silver on this one mountain, Potosi. But they had to weigh a certain amount. It didn't have to look a certain way. So if it weighed too much, they just snip some off the edge, right? And then for a piece of 8, which was a big coin, the way they would make change is they would cut it into wedges like a pizza. And so that's why it's called pieces of 8. It would be cut into 8 pieces to make change. Another thing here that's really nifty, you see this gold bar right here? And you see there's slices in it because they were cutting into it to make sure it was gold. They wanted to make sure it wasn't just gold plated. And so they would cut into those gold bars. And then a couple pieces here. This is a Khan, which is a tribe in West Africa, a Khan gold jewelry, which is a testament to the Witta's original occupation of being a slaving vessel. On board the Witta, they have found the world's oldest Akan jewelry. Once again, this is from modern-day Ghana in West Africa, because other Akan jewelry was melted down by European colonizers. They didn't care about like these beautiful, ornate pieces of jewelry that these master craftsmen had made, right? And so when they discovered the Witta, and they discovered this Akan jewelry on board, this is the world's oldest gold jewelry from that part of West Africa. These are what are known as manillas, and Barry only found these a few years ago. These are copper bracelets that would have been used as a trade good on the west coast of Africa to purchase enslaved Africans. So once again, a testament to the fact that the Witta was originally a slaving vessel. This is really cool. So this is a pistol they found. And one of the things you would see in the articles a lot was you had to keep your weapons very clean and functional, right? It was incumbent upon every pirate that their weapon be in like perfect working order. This was their business, right? Was fighting people. And so they had the height of military technology on these pirate vessels, the latest in any sort of weapon, guns, swords, you name it. And so this is a beautiful pistol here. Once again, just one shot. Has this Celtic god on the butt of it. And they found it with this silk ribbon. And what the pirates would do is they would tie a gun to either end of that silk ribbon, and they would wear it around their neck. And maybe they would have a couple of those or 3 of them. So because, once again, these are one-shot weapons, and so you would wear them around your neck, and that way you could get off maybe 4 shots, you know, if you had a couple of them tied around your neck, before you would have to resort to your boarding axe or your sword or your cutlass. And this is really neat because, you know, historians had heard of this, and they had read about it, but they were never sure if pirates really did this until they discovered this artifact on the wreck of the Witta. And now they know, yes, they did in fact tie silk around their guns. And so you can see here, this is a gun they found, and inside the gun, it was loaded. It had the tampon, the cork, the gunpowder, the ball, and the plate there says Galley 1713 from the gun. If you look over here, you'll see this is a primitive grenade that they discovered on board of the Witta. So they would take grenades and they would throw them on enemy boats before boarding them. But these were really not the grenades that we think of today. They were more to kind of like stun and scare people, smoke, noise, not as many fragments. Then these are different types of projectiles that you would fire out of a cannon. This is what's known as bar shot. So if you're a pirate, like you don't want to sink the boat that you're attacking. That would be counterproductive. You want it to stay afloat so you can rob it. And so what this bar shot would do is it would come out of the cannon spinning like this, and it would take down the sails and the rigging of the boat you were trying to capture, thereby slowing it down. And so once again, this is known as bar shot. Sometimes you'll see stuff that's chain shot. It'll be 2 balls connected by a chain. Same thing, comes out of the cannon like this, takes down rigging and sails. And then these are manacles that the enslaved Africans would have been placed in when it was a slaving vessel. And this is my final slide here. So you have here, this is what's known as a signet ring on the top corner there. So somebody would have taken that and put it in wax to seal a letter, for that wax seal that people used to do historically. Once again, some Akan jewelry from West Africa. And then one of the pirates is on board is the youngest pirate in world history, this kid John King. And so Black Sam Bellamy, they capture this boat, and it takes them about a week to get all the stuff off of it. And this kid's on board the boat, and he's really impressed with the pirates. He wants to join the pirates. And his mom's on board. No, 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 don't take my son. And he threatens to kill himself if the pirates don't take him. And so he's the youngest pirate in world history. And they discovered his fibula on board the Witta, including a silk stocking and a young boy's shoe. This is from John King. And they found it under cannon. So they imagine what happened was when the boat flipped over, a bunch of cannons came, probably crushed him to death. But they found his leg bone and the silk stocking and his shoe, some of the artifacts that they found on board the pirate ship Witta. So thank you for letting me talk to you about pirates for about an hour. It's always a pleasure. And I'd be happy to take questions at this time. And if you do have a question, Sean, who's working the cameras in the back room, asked that you use this microphone so that they can record it. So are there any questions? Yeah. Oh, yeah, use the microphone. There should be a green light on it. All right, so yeah, then Sean's recording you in the booth.
So if the crew came from a whole bunch of different places, and they had to sign the articles of the ship,
Sure.
how how did they deal with all the different languages?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that probably English was the lingua franca. I think it probably depended on, the majority of the boat. So if you had a boat that was majority French sailors, then probably most of the people spoke French. A lot of people at this time are multilingual, though, right? So if you were, a formerly enslaved African, maybe you had been in a French colony, like, Haiti, or a Spanish colony. So people would speak, multiple languages. Maybe you would speak your native language. If you were African heritage, you would speak an African language or two. Maybe you'd speak some English in addition to some Portuguese or French. But probably it was based on what the majority of the crew was. So as I said, French crew, you would speak French. But many of these individuals spoke multiple languages. So, great question. Yeah. Other questions?
If the Widow was the first genuine pirate ship discovered, have there been others in the decades since?
That's a great question. So I don't think that there's been anything authenticated, right? And so like for him to find this bell that said Widow Galley was like a huge deal. Now they have a boat that they think was Blackbeard's boat, which was the Queen Anne's Revenge. And they think they discovered the wreck of that. But it hasn't been authenticated the way that the Widow has. At one point in time, Barry Clifford thought he had discovered Captain Kidd's ship off the coast of Madagascar. And he wrote a book about it. He's kind of a shameless self-promoter. But it's not evident that this really was Captain Kidd's boat. So they have found some boats that they think, they're pretty sure, could have been, but nothing that's been authenticated the way that the Widow has been. Yeah, very good question.
Curious, what brought about the end of the golden age of piracy in New England?
Yeah, I mean, it was, at a certain point in time, it was profitable for the European powers because you had these pirates who were pirating goods that they would then go sell in colonies. In fact, this was a big deal in the Bahamas, right? The Bahamas has a hard time getting cloth and soaps and candles. And so the pirates would show up and they would sell this stuff, and it was worked out for the colony, so it was profitable for everybody. At a certain point in time, the merchants said, you know what, British government, French government, like this is really starting to cut into business. And so you had guys who had been pirates who would turn, and they would become pirate hunters. And so, I mean, one of the things that starts the golden age of piracy is the end of the War of Spanish Succession, in which you have all of a sudden like 30,000 British naval sailors who are all of a sudden out of work, and so a lot of them turn pirate. But one of the things that leads to the end of this period of piracy is just increased policing, and it was the merchants, said, hey, British government, French government, we are actually starting to lose a lot of money. These pirates are really starting to become more powerful than we can deal with, and they suppress them. And you know what they would do? They would pardon them sometimes. Hey, you come in now, we'll pardon you, right? Come in next year, we're going to hang you. So they would try to incentivize them that way. Pirates of Penzance, yeah. Popular culture. Yeah.
We were all noblemen who had gone wrong. We deferred to our queen.
I enjoyed Colin Woodard's book on Republic of Pirates.
Yeah.
Are there any other books like that that you think are worth a read?
So I would really recommend Marcus Rediker. Is this amazing maritime historian, and he wrote a book called Villains of All Nations. And I believe that was published in the 90s. And it's a wonderful book. It's the book that I had that chart where I showed you percentage of African sailors. So Villains of All Nations by Marcus Rediker, indispensable. The book that I mentioned by Eric J. Dolan is also a really good book. But it seems like it's a very popular topic, and every couple of years a new book on piracy comes out. There's a great book out there called The Pirate's Wife, which talks about specifically pirates that had families and their relationships with families, kind of like debunks that myth that they were all, kind of loners who were just out to make money and drink rum. But yeah, I would say like Marcus Rediker is great. And then if you start with Marcus Rediker, you could check out his bibliography, and then you would be inspired to look at other books. But that's a great place to start. Yeah, over here.
any chance that the phrase "a new all-time low" traces back to sociopath Edward Lowe and his sweating?
Not that I know of. Yeah, but that's I do love some of the terms that come from maritime culture that now have permeated maritime culture. I'll give you something to talk about. Your next cocktail party you go to, the term "to know the ropes" means to know all of the standing and running rigging on a historic sailing vessel. So, but as far as Edward Lowe goes, I've never heard that before.
You alluded to a couple of female pirates.
Yeah.
Can you tell us more about them?
Yeah, Anne Bonny and Mary Read were the female pirates. They're very well known. They were written about in Johnson's History of Piracy, which is, like a lot of what we know comes from just a couple of books that were written at the time, what we call primary sources. And then those have, permeated into the secondary sources. But Mary Read and Anne Bonny were a couple of well-known female pirates. They were, Mary Read was a cross-dressing soldier in the British Army before she turned pirate. And Anne Bonny is the girlfriend of Calico Jack Rackham. And they would dress as women when just kind of normal things were happening on the ship, but they would dress as men when they were in combat. And they apparently fought very ferociously, very adept fighters. And there was this famous incident where they're captured. And so Calico Jack and the other men pirates are all drunk. And they wind up being captured. But apparently Anne Bonny and Mary Read put up a heck of a fight. And so what happens is, Jack Rackham's going to be hung. But Anne Bonny and Mary Read are not hung because they are pregnant. They are with child. And at that time, you could not legally hang a pregnant woman. So they what was known as pleading your belly. They pled their bellies. And they were not hung. And so Anne Bonny said to Jack before he was hung, she said, "Jack, I'm sorry to see you go, but had you fought like a man, you needn't die like a dog," is what she famously said to him. And then, one of them perishes from disease soon thereafter. The other one disappears from history. But they're probably the most well-known European female pirates. But there is a female pirate in China in the 1800s who is probably the most powerful pirate ever to exist in world history. She had a fleet of 30,000 pirates under her control in the 1800s. Chai Sen was her name. But so there are instances of female pirates, not just in European culture, but kind of around the world. But the most famous are Mary Read and Anne Bonny. They were from that golden age of piracy that some of us are familiar with. Yeah. All right, folks. Well, thanks so much for coming out. I really appreciate getting a chance to talk to you. Come visit me in South Portland sometime, all right?